Okay, so I was originally going to do a talk about a bunch of different man-made disasters that I found really interesting, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on what I think is the most interesting one. Go. Okay. In the early 1900s, molasses was a standard sweetener used in the United States. It was also used it could be distilled and used, fermented and distilled into rum. So that was another use for it. And it was also used in the production of munitions. So you can picture like the early 1910s or mid 1910s. We have World War I on the horizon, so we're ramping up munition production. And we also have Prohibition coming, so they're trying to outrace Prohibition and get as much rum produced as they can. So knowing this, the Purity Distilling Company, which was later bought by U.S. Industrial Alcohol, which will come in later, they built a 50-foot high by 90-foot wide storage tank in the north end of Boston, right where that red circle is. So, just for reference, if you've ever been to the Boston office, that's down here. The area where it was is actually right where, if you're familiar with the north end, it's right where like the bocce courts are now and the baseball field. So that's where they built that thing. So here's the completed tank. During construction, they didn't really cut corners so much as they just ignored them. The guy who was in charge of construction, I can't remember his name right now, but he wasn't an engineer and didn't know how to read blueprints. And they also never bothered to consult an engineer. So they finished it, and on the first day it leaked. And this was pretty well known. So what families in the neighborhood would send their children over to collect molasses from the leaking tank to use at home. So some of the workers thought we should probably do something about this. So they raised the issue, and at the time I think it was still Purity Distilling, said, well, fuck it, let's just paint it brown so they won't notice. So, yeah. What could go wrong, right? That's what went wrong. So it might be hard to make out, but basically those buildings are all leveled. The tank was somewhere in this area. And so 2.3 million gallons of molasses were spilled out of the tank. It's what's called the Boston Molasses disaster, for obvious reasons. So bystanders reported feeling the ground rumble and hearing what they reported as machine gun fire. What that actually was the rivets popping out of the tank. A 25-foot wave of molasses came roaring down the street, and it was moving at 35 miles an hour. So as you can see, it leveled all these buildings. People and horses and dogs were either drowned or crushed in the buildings. Good times. This is the elevated railway that used to be on Atlantic Avenue, actually until, the last 10 years or so. You can see the wave actually damaged the steel girders, and it has subsided by the time this photo was taken, but the wave actually tilted the train car that was on the tracks at the time off the train tracks. It landed back down. It didn't actually get knocked all the way over. But there was a truck in the area that was picked up and deposited into Boston Harbor. Also, people that weren't affected by the wave itself, there were reports that they were knocked back several feet by just the rush of air that was coming through the neighborhood. Ultimately, this report here says kills 11 and 50 injuries. That actually rose with, in the coming weeks, that number rose to 21 dead and 150 injured. The cleanup took, I think it was estimated at 30,000 hours or something like that. So basically what they had to do, they found that they couldn't just wash the molasses away. It was having no effect, so they found that they could pump seawater and use that to get that to force the molasses down the drains, which had the effect of turning Boston Harbor brown until August. And also, obviously molasses is very sticky, so people would come to see the site, or people who were working on the site would track it everywhere throughout the city. So onto trains, onto train platforms, onto the seats of trains, into the suburbs when they got off the trains. So it took years and years and years to fully clean up everywhere. And for decades after there would be people in the neighborhood on hot days in the summer, and they would say it smells like molasses. It was probably just folk story, but yeah. So this is my quote. So when I heard this story, which was actually kind of recently, I was it's hard to conceive of a 25-foot wave of molasses, but I'm willing to accept that there can be a 25-foot wave of molasses when you're talking about 2.3 million gallons. But 35 miles an hour, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you would think if there was a 25-foot wave of molasses coming at me, I'd have time to say, look, there's a 25-foot wave of molasses. I should get my things and move out of the way. So for this talk, I was like, well, how does molasses travel at 35 miles an hour? So the answer is that it's a non-Newtonian liquid. And the picture I have up there is of that bottle of ketchup, because ketchup is also a non-Newtonian liquid. And I don't really know what that means. But for the purposes of this talk, what it means is that its viscosity is determined by the pressure and forces applied to it. So the ketchup bottle, when you hold it in your hand and you tilt it side to side, nothing really moves. But if you've left a ketchup bottle in the refrigerator for a while and then taken it out and opened it, sometimes that ketchup will just come squirting right out, right? And it comes out fast. So that's kind of the same thing that happened with the tank. So the idea is, the thinking is that the molasses had fermented in the tank, which is not what it was for. It wasn't built to ferment the molasses. It was just built to hold it. And so excess carbon dioxide had built up, increasing the pressure. And we already talked about how there were many leaks, and there were also some cracks, it turns out. And one of those stress cracks down by the bottom of the tank gave way. And the thinking was that some really unseasonably warm temperatures and massive swings in the temperature, it went from like 2 degrees the day before to 40 degrees the day of, contributed to some of the stress on the tank. So that's it about the disaster. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, they tried to claim that it was sabotaged and that it wasn't their fault. And they said they were sabotaged by anarchists who were against the use of molasses in the production of munitions. And it took 6 years, but eventually a federal judge threw that out. And they paid $7,000 to the survivors of fatal victims, which is about $125,000 each today. The disaster prompted Massachusetts and other states to implement inspections for large construction projects. So that was kind of the start of a lot of those laws that we have today. Yeah, that's all I had. And I have several other disasters that are really interesting. So, if you're interested in that kind of thing, talk to me later. That's it.